Hello, welcome to East Asia Institute, EAI's online webinar. I am Yul Sohn, President of EAI and your host. Today's topic is International Trade Order in Disarray, Possible Strategies for United States and Korea. This is a part of the COVID-19 and the New World Order webinar series. In the past few years, the world has witnessed a significant disruption of the international trade system and the rise of managed trade. There are three sources, I think. One, there is a widespread protectionism, particularly among the advanced industrial countries, mainly due to the backlash of neoliberal globalization. We see an increasing political support and often populist support for protecting the losers from trade, which is internationally uncompetitive sectors, regions, and workers. Second, there is a US-China strategic competition which contributes to the disarray of the system. Strategic rivalry causes securitization of trade as states use trade as a means to foreign policy and manage trade in the name of national security. So here there are misuses or overuses of invoking national security in regulating international trade and investment. Finally, COVID-19, which draws our attention to the vulnerability in global value chain, which makes a national security problem as well. So here, states regulate exports of strategic goods while expanding imports of those, which is in contrast to the usual protectionism that restricts imports and encourages exports. So all this presents an enormous challenge to the trading states like South Korea. So we are here to address these issues and find solutions regarding how to stabilize and recover the international and regional trade order or rules-based trade order, what roles United States and Korea can take, how both countries can cooperate, and what areas should be focused to inform policy decisions for the countries. So to discuss this topic, I am honored to be able to host excellent panels today. Let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mireya Solis, my good friend. Mireya is Director of the Center for East Asian Policy Studies, Philip Knight Chair in Japanese Studies, and a Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution. Prior to Brookings, she was a tenured associate professor at American University's School of International Service. She received a PhD from Harvard University, an expert on Japanese foreign economic policy, US-Japan relations and international trade policy, and Asia-Pacific economic integration. Her most recent publications include Dilemmas of a Trading Nation, Japan and the United States in the Evolving Asia-Pacific. Our second speaker is Professor Jae-min Lee, who teaches at Seoul National University Law School. Dr. Lee received LLM and PhD in law at Seoul National University, and his JD at Boston College, and LLM at George Washington University. Prior to SNU, he was a lawyer at the Washington-based Wilkie Farr and Gallagher LPP, and also served as a career diplomat at the ROK Ministry of Foreign Affairs. His main area of interest is international trade law and international investment law. Our third speaker is Professor Wang-Hui Lee of Aju University. He is currently serving as a Dean of the Division of the International Studies. He is a regular participant of EAI events and research projects. He is an EAI scholar. His main area of interest has been the issues of political economy of economic policy and institutions in East Asian countries, with special focus on China and South Korea. His recent publications include Politics of Economic Reform in Korea, Pulling South Korea Away from Chinese Orbit, and Crisis Management of the COVID-19 Pandemic in South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Professor Lee received his PhD from London School of Economics and Political Science. Our moderator today is Dr. Tae-ho Park, currently president of the Lee & Co. Global Commerce Institute. President Park had a distinguished career. He served as a Minister of Trade from 2011 to 13 and the Ambassador at Large for International Economy and Trade from 13 to 14. Prior to that, he was a long-term professor at Seoul National University, a leading scholar in international trade. Dr. Park also served the Vice President for the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, KIEP, and an Assistant Professor of Economics at George Washington University. I'm really honored to be able to invite President Park as today's moderator. So now over to you, President Park.
Washington University. I just want to correct that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No? Okay. Well, I'm the moderator of today's webinar. I would like to really thank Professor Son Yul and the EAI for hosting this online webinar on the very timely topic regarding international order, strategic competition between the US and China, and also a lot of influences on other countries, including South Korea. I was going to introduce our excellent panelists, but already Professor Son introduced in detail the background of each panelist. Only thing I want to do is time allocation. We are given, I think, 53 minutes for our discussion. So I have to manage the time very tightly. And the organizer gave me, I don't know the reason, but gave me very specific time allocation, different minutes for different people. Okay, after we hear panelist presentation, as the organizer already told you, we would like to answer some of the questions collected from the online participants, maybe in Korea or South Korea. But if there are not enough questions and we still have time, then we have a short session to discuss among panelists. That's how I run this webinar. Without further ado, I would like to invite the first panelist, Dr. Mireya Solis, to speak on the international trading order in an area of strategic competition and implication for South Korea. Dr. Solis, please. You are
Thank you very much.
13 minutes, 13 minutes, okay?
Yes, thank you so much, President Park. It's an honor to be here with you in this event and with the other distinguished panelists. And thank you very much for the kind introduction, Yul. And I am very grateful to the East Asian Institute for the invitation. So in my brief remarks, I want to touch on three issues: the crisis of the trading system, the growing importance of middle power trade diplomacy, and opportunities for US re-engagement, and offer some thoughts on what I believe are some of the most important choices that South Korea faces ahead. So very briefly, I'll start with a very gloomy depiction of the current state of the international trading system, unfortunately. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the rules-based trading system faces an existential crisis, because the challenges come from many directions. There is, of course, something that has been with us for quite a while, and that is WTO dysfunction, first manifested in the stagnation of the negotiation process, the fact that WTO has had a very difficult time updating the toolkit of rules of trade and investment to keep up with the realities, the changing realities of the world economy. Add to that now the crisis in the enforcement arm of the WTO with the appellate body ceasing operations. This then raises a problem that we may not be able to enforce the existing rules. So we're not innovating enough, and we're not perhaps enforcing the body of rules that we have. Another very important stress that the international trading system is suffering comes from great power competition between the United States and China. And I'll explain that in more detail, but then the other third factor is something that has already been mentioned, and that is the pandemic shock. And I think that it has been very discouraging to see that export protectionism has been on the rise. It has affected medical supplies, personal protection equipment, vaccines, but also that we see more and more pressures or rhetoric around the question of deglobalization, of bringing home supply chains. I think that across the board, renationalization of international production is not feasible. It's not advisable, but nevertheless, the fact that these pressures are growing represents a challenge for existing patterns of economic interdependence. But I think that I want to spend more time giving more texture to the nature of US-China strategic competition and what this means for the international trading system. In my mind, China's recommitment to a state capitalism model to achieve self-sufficiency in high-tech sectors and the sectoral restrictions it imposes on foreign direct investment, practices such as forced technology transfer and digital protectionism have created great strain on the trading system. So we have a China that seems to have less appetite for economic reform, but is much more consequential to the international trading system. On the other hand, the United States has had some quite tumultuous years, to be quite frank, and the Trump administration embraced the notion of America first and pursued an America first trade policy, which had profound consequences given the significance of the United States in the trading system. And if I were to characterize the approach of the Trump administration, I would say that it was deep skepticism of multilateralism, in particular the WTO, the resort to the tariff as a main tool to try to achieve its objectives, and tariffs, unilateral tariffs that were applied on allies and rivals alike, and tariffs that were used as a negotiation leverage with China, and they resulted in what we call the phase one trade deal, which was really just a truce of sorts. And I think that it did not really touch on the core issues around Chinese industrial policy that motivated the exercise to begin with. But they did produce some series of massive commitments in the order of $200 billion from China to purchase American goods. And these commitments were unrealistic, but also trade diverting. So again, the rules-based trading system took a hit. And add to that, one other thing that we saw frequently during the Trump years, and is not going away, is the use of the so-called national security tariffs. They were applied to metal and aluminum. And what this did is that because they were applied fundamentally on partners and allies, they prevented coordination to address the China challenge. The United States has been concerned with the leakage of critical technology to China and therefore has adopted many defensive economic measures, tighter screening of foreign direct investment. There's a revision now underway on the export control regime to cover foundational and emerging technologies. And the US government has placed several Chinese technology firms on the entity list, which means that sales of the most advanced chips and other components are now restricted. And China seems to be gearing up to retaliate in kind, having adopted recently an export control law and more recently the counter foreign sanction law. So there's a lot of tension between the two largest economies in the world, and there's a lot of securitization or politicization of international economic exchange going on. Now, if there is a note of hope, I would say, in this difficult landscape, I think it's a greater initiative demonstrated by middle powers in moving forward mega trade agreements, such as a comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And let me just say a word on each of these mega trade agreements and why they're so significant. I think that when the United States walked out the door and left the TPP, abandoned the TPP after it had been signed but not yet ratified, there were a lot of doubts as to whether this agreement could actually survive. And I think it has to do the ability to rescue these trade agreement, which is a very ambitious trade agreement in terms of the rules, in terms of the tariff elimination targets. I think we should really give credit to the pragmatism of the remaining 11 countries, because what they decided to do was to keep the tariff schedules intact and then just talk about the suspension of narrowly defined rules in the new agreement on areas that only Americans had championed, and once Americans had left, it made sense to suspend their application, and most of them had to do with intellectual property provisions. Now, why is the TPP so important? I would make the case that it's for middle powers now, it provides a way to hedge against the adverse trends of Chinese mercantilism and US retrenchment. And the question that the CPTPP now faces is its potential growth. And the promise of this agreement has always laid on the fact that it's geared to expand, to bring new members. Now, it is the UK who has now been the first country to formally initiate the accession talks. And I think this would give us a good sense of how the process will work out, if it's nimble enough to bring other members. And there is some signals coming from China that they're also interested in joining the CPTPP. I would be very positive about such development if China was willing to really abide by the high standards of the CPTPP. But to be quite frank, I'm not seeing that appetite for far-reaching reform the way in which we knew that China wanted to use, say, the accession to the WTO to leverage significant change for the domestic economy. That doesn't seem to me to be the spirit driving Chinese interest, and therefore it would be important to make sure that any such conversation would not result in lowering the standards and level of ambition of the CPTPP. Regarding the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, quite frankly, it's the largest trade agreement once it enters into force. And the combination of tariff reductions, lenient rules of origin, and liberalization of foreign direct investment and services, I think will have a very salutary effect in boosting regional production networks. I think that one hallmark of a successful trade negotiation, and here I, of course, defer to President Bark because he's the practitioner, but one hallmark would seem to me that countries come away from the negotiation feeling that they each pocketed a win, and therefore they have a stake in seeing the success of this trade agreement. I think for ASEAN, it was a high noon for its regional diplomacy, and they were able to sustain the principle of ASEAN centrality. For the three Northeast Asian economies, China, South Korea, and Japan, this is the first time that you have preferential trade among the three largest economies in Northeast Asia, and therefore there's expected to be large gains from trade. But I think that even though China was not the main driver of these negotiations, China accomplished a lot because it did not have to surrender many of its tools of industrial policy, and nevertheless it blunted this narrative that the world is decoupling from China. Hard to make that case when China is part of the largest trade grouping in the world. Now, the common denominator between CPTPP and RCEP is that the United States is not there. And that is, of course, a great problem for the United States. I think that the challenges that the United States faces is marginalization from the regional economic architecture and a need to boost its credibility after abandoning the CPTPP. I think there's a lot to like in the Biden agenda in terms of focusing on boosting the domestic safety net, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about domestic competitiveness, relaunching or nurturing alliances and partnerships. But there's one big gap here, one gaping hole. We don't have a proactive trade strategy going forward. So I think that there's plenty of things that the United States and South Korea could do together in terms of coordinating to boost supply chain resilience, in terms of negotiating digital trade agreements, in terms of thinking about COVID response. But I think at the end of the day, the United States should find its way back to the CPTPP, and I think that South Korea should do as well. My last observation, because I don't want to abuse the time given to me, is as follows. What are the implications of all these trends for South Korea? I would say that as an open, technologically advanced trading nation, South Korea's stakes in the preservation of the rules-based trading order could not be higher. And to that end, as I said before, South Korea could cooperate with the United States in ensuring the viability of supply chains, disseminating rules on the digital economy. But there's one area where my advice is going to be for our South Korean friends to go ahead of us. I would recommend exploring and joining the CPTPP. I don't see the United States making any decisive move on that front. Trade Promotion Authority expired last week. Nobody seemed to complain. And that's why I think that it would be good to add the heft of South Korea to the CPTPP, and that could increase incentives for the United States. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Solis. You also speak, very within the time limit, so that we can move on very efficiently for our webinar. I now invite Professor Jamin Lee to speak on reassessing CPTPP in the changed global trading landscape. Professor Lee, I'll give you 8 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Park. I also would like to thank East Asia Institute and President Sohn for organizing this event and inviting me for this very important topic. I just would like to share what was just explained by Dr. Solis. I to share the views and conclusions that Dr. Solis just mentioned. Perhaps I could add a couple of things to invigorate our discussion today. First of all, with respect to the WTO, I think now, using the term Dr. Solis just used, we are now at the stage of existential risk for the WTO and multilateralism, and we should do something specific and very fast. And MC12 is coming up soon in December, and that will be a critical point, a critical moment for the global community to find some signs of restoring multilateralism. I think perhaps we should focus on just easy things, not the difficult things, just easy things to send the message that WTO is now at least working to find some solution. Just perhaps 2 things. Number one, again, as Dr. Solis mentioned, I think the first issue is and it should be how to restore the function of the appellate body. Still, there's a long way to go, and now nobody's there in the 7-member body. There's nobody's left for the appellate body, and it is critical to find a compromise solution to restore the appellate body and resume the function of the appellate body by appointing 7 members for the restoration of the function of the appellate body as soon as possible. I think that's the first thing that we should focus on. It will be difficult, but still that seems to be something doable as long as the states and the members of the WTO can find some compromising ground reflecting the concerns of the United States, which are well known by now, and the concerns of other countries such as EU, Japan, and other countries as well. I think some compromising ground can be found. Secondly, I think we should focus on the fisheries subsidies. I understand that the negotiations on the fisheries subsidies are the most advanced at this stage. And this is the area where states have the strongest commonality, so to speak, in finding the final end game. If that is the case, then perhaps the WTO members can focus on fisheries subsidies and finalize it at least at the MC12 stage. So perhaps if we can do at least those two things, then those two things can provide some meaningful seeds to revive the discussions and the debates on how to reform the WTO for the future, including industrial subsidies and all those important subjects. So perhaps those two things could be the priority issues for the time being, in my view. And in the meantime, again, let me underscore the issue Dr. Solis just mentioned, which is middle power and the role of the CPTPP and CEP. Well, with respect to the CPTPP, Korea is now trying to join the CPTPP sometime soon. In retrospect, Korea should have joined TPP and CPTPP negotiation as an original member, but now Korea is trying to join the CPTPP as a new member. And there are many questions to be answered in that process. And again, as a trading nation and as a state which supports strong multilateralism, I think CPTPP is a good option for Korea. It's a mega FTA along the Asia-Pacific region, and I would think Korea should join CPTPP if at all possible. In the past, and now more than so now, because of the faltering multilateralism and the bleak situation at the WTO, I think CPTPP is a good option for Korea to pursue at this stage. At the same time, the question is the admission fee or the membership fee. It could be an easier accession, but it could be a very difficult accession for Korea. If you look at the accession protocol, accession document annexed to the CPTPP, it is almost identical to the WTO accession process, very lengthy, and it basically requires the agreement from 11 existing members, which could be quite tricky for Korea, considering Korea-Japan situation, and also considering the failed FTA between Korea and Mexico, and also considering all the outstanding issues that Korea has had with respect to its FTA partners of the past decade. So all those issues possibly could come up in the accession process for Korea. So Korea's situation, I think, is different from UK. So Korea has FTAs with 9 out of 11 states of CPTPP members, and those bilateral issues could come up in the Korea's accession process. And the question mark is how to deal with those issues, how Korea will deal with those issues, and how other countries will put those issues on the table for the accession process. So there's a big question mark for the membership process and membership fee. Hopefully, 11 states and Korea can find a solution and find a mutually beneficial solution for the membership of Korea, but that could be a lengthy and difficult process for Korea, I think. And secondly, again, I hope United States can return to the CPTPP, but practically speaking, it seems to be quite difficult, or maybe too ambitious for us to expect, but hopefully United States can return to the CPTPP. But at the same time, one thing that we could consider from the perspective of the United States, and also from the perspective of Korea, is the fact that the value or the attractiveness or the benefit of the CPTPP may have dwindled over the years. It used to be the most, I think, the most innovative agreement at that time. But after 8 years, many issues have changed. Each investment chapter is now being rewritten by other fora in many different FTAs and many different discussion forums. Investment chapter and digital economy chapter, the e-commerce chapter is also being rewritten by other fora as well. For instance, the Australia and Singapore, the CPTPP partners, have concluded their own digital economy agreement. New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore, also the CPTPP partners, concluded their trilateral digital economy agreement. That could signal that the CPTPP's e-commerce chapter is not as elaborated or as updated as to be able to address the current the tasks, the current difficulties the countries are facing in the area of digital economy. Also, state-owned enterprise chapter, which is very controversial in many countries, and still many practitioners and many government officials seem to be wondering about the exact meaning of key provisions there, including fisheries subsidies as well, and SPS chapter as well. So all those issues are very important, and these provisions set forth important norms for many countries, but at the same time, the rules still very advanced compared to RCEP and compared to other FTAs, but at the same time, the margin of superiority or the edge, the CPTPP's edge over RCEP or CPTPP's the freshness vis-a-vis other FTAs have been dwindled and have been narrowed over the years. So then the question mark is how many countries will...
Could you wrap up soon?
Sure, Minister Park. Will reassess the benefit of the CPTPP in the changed landscape. So that will be a question mark for Korea's accession and perhaps possibly US accession effort as well. Thank you. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Sorry to bother you, but anyway, thank you very much, Professor Jae-min Lee, for your very comprehensive analysis regarding CPTPP and also each, members, the countries who want to join or may not join in the future, the specific positions of these countries. Now move on to the last panelist, Professor Wang-Hee Lee. I think he will talk about the various issues related to US-China strategic competition, WTO reforms, CPTPP, South Korean strategy. Maybe he's wrapping up all the discussion we have so far. Professor Lee, please, you have 8 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much for having me and Mr. Minister Park and President Yul Sohn. Actually, the EAI gave me 4 questions, and I will reply them one by one. And let me be clear that by and large, I totally agree with Dr. Mireya Solis and Professor Lee Jae-min. But because I'm a political economist, and I will highlight the strategic aspects of the international trade. Okay, let me start with the first question, the impact of the US-China strategic competition in the global and regional trade order. I think that in terms of trade balances, so far, the trade war has no significant impact. Actually, the full effects of export control on key industries are not yet to be seen, although there are some trade diversion took place. In terms of trade balances, I think the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has much more visible in the early stage when the United States and China imposed lockdown on key industrial areas. And I expect that it will take a long time for the United States to shift its supply chain away from China. Let me move on to the second question, the prospects of the WTO reform and the expansion of the CPTPP. As long as the Biden administration maintains an inward-looking trade policy, China's grip on the WTO will not be loosened. Unlike the Trump administration, the Biden administration tried to make a compromise with the EU and UK, but there is still long way to go. By the way, as Dr. Miriam Solis mentioned, at the APEC summit in November 2020, Chinese President Xi Jinping said that China favorably considered joining CPTPP. For this reason, China can join the CPTPP earlier than anticipated. And when it comes to the third question, I think there are broad consensus on its positive effect of the CPTPP. As you know well, CPTPP is much more ambitious than any other FTAs, including RCEP, in many aspects. First of all, CPTPP will upgrade trade rules, including labor and environment standard and digital trade. Also, CPTPP can provide a stepping stone to revive multilateralism in East Asia. Finally, CPTPP will ease trade tension in this region if the United States and China join together. In terms of the role of the Japan, the United Kingdom, and Taiwan, we have to consider many aspects of the CPTPP and supply chains. First of all, Japan has played a leading role in launching the CPTPP since the Trump administration left the TPP. For this reason, I think Japan's contribution is likely to grow because the country is at the heart of the regional supply chain. Regarding Taiwan, yes, TSMC has already considered investing in Japan to diversify supply chain away from China. Therefore, Japan-Taiwan relations will be strengthened. But I am very skeptical of the role of the United Kingdom. As you know, UK is geographically distant, and its link with the supply chain in East Asia is very limited. And I don't think that the UK will play a crucial role in this region. And final question is about the possible South Korea's strategy. I believe many the other panelists, Korea should join the CPTPP as soon as possible. Actually, CPTPP is an ally sharing in the strategic industry such as semiconductor, battery, rare earth element, and medicine, such as COVID vaccine. And CPTPP will contribute solving trade conflict between Korea and Japan. And finally, CPTPP will help Korea to diversify export market and therefore reduce its high dependence on China. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lee, another Professor Lee. You tried to address all the questions raised by the conference organizer. So far, I don't see any questions raised by our online participants. So I'll just move on to our own discussion among our panelists. Let me take this opportunity to ask a few questions to each of your panelists. First of all, the Professor Solis, you talk about the U.S. trade policy. I mean, Trump and then also Biden. Biden administration, he himself said that he will respect the multilateral trading system, and also he will work with the alliances. But also he wants to say America is back. I'll be leading the multilateral trading system, whatever that kind of statement. But he didn't do anything so far in terms of correcting something which was done by Trump, unilateral actions. like the steel quota imposed on Korea, which is bad. Really, this is like a voluntary export restraint. I mean, Korea should not have accepted this kind of request from the United States. But also, he's maintaining all the tariffs imposed on Chinese products, all kind of things. So he didn't, he says something which is different from Trump, but he didn't do anything to show us we are now respecting more rules-based trading order, whatever. So I want to see your opinion about this situation, and then I will ask Professor Jamin Lee. You know what? At the end of June, the investigation results on supply chain of a few important items, semiconductor, battery, and whatever. So based on this kind of investigation, U.S. Administration and also U.S. Congress are starting to pour huge amount of money to the so-called advanced technology area, specifically semiconductors and things like that. And the thing is, you mentioned briefly about WTO reform, and one of the reform idea subjects should include subsidy agreement, industrial subsidy agreement, which is targeting so-called China's industrial policy. But while you are complaining about the U.S., Chinese industrial policy, which is, producing overcapacity, distorting trade, lots of complaints. And now they are doing, maybe it's not the whole industrial policy, but, some specific area. How do we see the future of some kind of improvement of industrial policy within the WTO system? Lastly, to Professor Wang Hui Lee, you briefly mentioned of the role of Taiwan, which means that Taiwan may also apply for acceding to the CPTPP in the future. So this is my questions. I mean, we'll start with Dr. Solis.
Thank you so much for that excellent question, President Park. I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, I think that there is an important change, but there's also very significant continuities in when we moved from President Trump to President Biden. So I do think it makes a difference when you have an American administration who is willing to be more constructive in discussing WTO reform, who is willing to coordinate more with allies and not bash them, and who's not going to be fixated on the trade deficit as the metric by which all economic relationships are to be assessed. But nonetheless, there's a lot of skepticism in the current American administration on free trade. And it's hard to say free trade. Now the word has to be free and fair trade. And, I think that tariffs are addictive. They create vested interest. They create groups that want to protect now the new status quo. So I think that there's been a lot of resistance from the steel industry, for example, to see those tariffs eliminated. And this continues to be a source of friction with allies and partners. And the steel quota, I couldn't agree more with you that was, of course, distorting. It's a managed trade approach. With the Europeans, there have been some improvement recently on trade talks on subsidies for aircraft manufacture, but they have not yet found a way to eliminate the so-called 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel, with talks still ongoing. But I also think it's not just what the Biden administration is keeping in place, but where this might be going. And I think Professor Lee already mentioned the recent supply chain study or report that the White House commissioned. There was a 100-day report. And it's really interesting because I do see it, to me, it's a contradiction, if you will. There is a desire to coordinate with allies, and therefore the term that Professor Lee mentioned has already been also picked, the ally shoring, right? The idea is that we want to build trusted supply networks. Therefore, Korean companies, Japanese companies, Taiwanese companies are companies that we should be doing more business with. But on the other hand, in the same report, you have a lot of the same spirit of, us first, with the Buy America provisions that are highlighted there, with a fast, what they call trade enforcement strike force, something to that nature. And at the end of the day, I don't think that these tensions are being resolved. And it's important, if we really want to build relations of trust, that we send a message that we do not believe that trade agreements have been used unfairly always. But that's something that this administration so far is not prepared to say, and has to do a lot with the politics, the support basis for the Democratic Party. But I also think it's important that the American president goes to the region and hears from leaders as to how, without this, it's very hard to compete with China if you're not going to be talking about, let's sit at the table. And my last point, this administration, when they think about trade, they're thinking a lot about labor standards, about eliminating forced labor from supply chains, and promoting a race to the top. I don't think you can do that if you're not at the table. And therefore, it's important to put the weight of the American market to make sure that these rules and these disciplines can really be adopted more broadly.
Thank you, Dr. Solis. How about Professor Jae-min Lee?
Thank you, Minister Park. Thank you for the very important question. That's right. Many countries are now contemplating providing massive support for key industrial areas, mainly the semiconductor area or other infrastructure-related area all over the world, including Korea as well. Many countries are contemplating finding support packages for key industries in their territories. And United States as well is now considering providing massive support for the semiconductor industry and other related industries. And the question then is the subsidies agreement. I think that's exactly right. I think the problem for now, for the WTO and for many countries now, is that the subsidies agreement of the WTO is outdated. Most importantly, the fundamental problem of the subsidies agreement of the WTO now is that it does not have a carve-out for legitimate governmental industrial policies. So be it COVID-19 emergency measure, or core industry support measure, or environmental protection measure, there's no carve-out, at least legally, in the subsidies agreement. And that absence has raised concerns and has fostered disputes among many states. And to some extent, the US-China dispute is also triggered by the absence of the norms. On the one hand, United States is complaining about China's industrial policy. On the other hand, China is making its own argument. And then the question mark and the repeated mantra is that my support is okay, but your support is a problem. That type of approach has raised concerns over the WTO's subsidy regime. And I think that regime should be changed. And I think that issue is already being addressed by the United States and the EU and Japan to carve out and to elaborate the subsidy norms in the WTO agreement in a way that can distinguish good subsidies and necessary subsidies and bad subsidies, so as to address the concerns of the states. But in the meantime, the current agreement applies, and the support measures of the United States and support measures of other countries could be problematic, at least legally, under the current legal prism. That is a problem, I think. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much. But you already mentioned that the WTO should start with the easy subject. I raised a very important difficult subject. Given the decision-making mechanism of the WTO, it will be awfully difficult in the future to make any changes on subsidy issues. Let me now turn to Professor Wang-Hee Lee. How about Taiwan's position?
Yeah. Thank you for raising a very interesting question, Minister Park. Actually, yeah, because after the semiconductor shortage, Taiwan is very hot. Everyone is talking about TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. As you know well, yes, because of the political sensitivity, Chinese scholars or bureaucrats have no mention on Taiwan. One China policy constrains every relation with Taiwan at the moment. The best example is a dual circulation strategy, presented by the Xi Jinping last year, but there is no mention of Taiwan. This is a political reality. But yeah, in terms of economics, yeah, there is a very different story. Actually, yeah, Taiwan is the largest importer to China in 2020. Before then, yes, Korea had been the largest importer from 2013 to 2019. That means that yes, Taiwan play a crucial role in almost every Chinese industries, especially TSMC. China's industry cannot survive, I think, without Taiwan semiconductors. In this respect, yes, I think China have every reason to strengthen, not reduce, its supply chain with Taiwan. That means, yes, I think there is some possibility for Taiwan can to join CPTPP sooner or later. Yeah, that's my answer. Thank you.
I have some questions from the organizer in the chatting area. The first thing, this question is to me regarding the CPTPP negotiation process for Korea. Actually, Professor Jae-min Lee mentions Korea's position. Even until last year, our official position of the Korean government was very uncertain. They didn't show any positive or definite kind of positions at that time. But when Biden administration comes in, Korea's position changed a little bit into more positive direction. But still, they don't decide whether they really apply for official, membership to the CPTPP. So still, Korea is considering because there are many issues. Jae-min Lee, Professor Lee mentioned about the agricultural issues and automobile issues, facing the Japan-Korea relations. So given this kind of difficulties, how can Korea do something so that we can join the CPTPP? I think, out of 11 existing CPTPP members, we have FTA, bilateral FTAs with 9 countries except Japan and Mexico. Mexico all along doesn't want to have FTA with Korea. That's my own experience. They don't feel like any benefit having FTA, bilateral FTA with Korea. But CPTPP is different. So what I'm saying is here, even though we may face some difficulties, this can be overcome. We already give a lot more market access for agricultural product to United States. Why not give the same kind of access to Canada or Australia? It's not really difficult. We can talk about this, and also for our agricultural people, we can give some support when we join the CPTPP. And second, they are worrying about our automobile sector. If you lower the tariff to Japanese automobile export to Korea, we will be hurt. But already through Korea-US FTA, Japanese auto companies manufacturing in the United States, they're coming into Korea without tariff. So it's also we can talk about this, but technically we can resolve the issue. And what about the political sensitivity between Korea and Japan? I think because of that, we should use non-economic area to promote our relations. which means that the non-economic area means CPTPP is more economic area, not political area. So this is a way for Korea and Japan to move toward more like a more friendly or more normal kind of relationship rather than keeping the country from each other, talk about political issues. So I think CPTPP, I sometimes wrote an article in the newspaper. I said that even though we want to join, we cannot join right away. At the least, we can apply officially, just like the UK did, to the CPTPP new membership, and then wait, and then go for the individual process, negotiation process. If these existing members are imposing too much kind of prices, then we can say, oh no, we cannot join you because it's extraordinarily too much burden to Korea. But the thing is, CPTPP members should consider the benefits out of Korea's joining to CPTPP because Korea is the 9th largest trading nation. Korea joined the CPTPP, make significance of the CPTPP much higher. So I think both parties has a mutual interest. So that I hope Korea can join soon. Maybe this government may apply for the membership officially or wait for the next government. I don't know, but as a trade expert, we have to do this kind of thing. I spent too much time. We have only 4 minutes left, but there are some other questions. Especially the Professor Wang-Hee Lee mentioned that maybe China joined the CPTPP, but we don't want to take too much time. But China's accession to CPTPP, China shows some interest, but this realistically is far from the real kind of option because China cannot join the CPTPP at this moment, but they just show some kind of interest. Well, we have 4 minutes left. I will give 1 minute to each panelist, just to give some impression or something. Starting with Wang-Hee Lee, Professor. Turn on your microphone. Turn on the microphone.
Yes. Yeah, I said Korea should join, not can or yes, able to. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yes, Korea, as Minister Park said, yeah, Korea can benefit at joining CPTPP for many industrial areas. That's what I would like to emphasize. Yeah, that's it.
Professor Jae-min Lee.
Thank you, Minister Park. I also think that CPTPP is very important for Korea, and Korea should try to join the CPTPP as soon as possible. And I think the question is not just the CPTPP, but the norms and provisions included in the CPTPP are very indicative in other free trade agreements and the WTO negotiations as well. So the efforts to join the CPTPP could also help Korea or other countries like Korea, such as Thailand, Indonesia, to cope with or to address future negotiations in other forums as well. So in that regard, CPTPP accession is important for Korea strategically. Thank you.
And then Professor Solis.
Thank you. Just a comment on, I found it very, very persuasive, your comments on Japan and South Korea in the context of CPTPP and how that membership in that trading grouping could actually help advance the bilateral relationship. I think that that is a very positive way to move things forward. I think if we were to define bilateral relations by just focusing on the issues where the tensions are very high, the divisions are very deep, it's very difficult to make progress. But if we think about economic integration and advancing through the CPTPP, advancing also through plurilateral digital trade agreements, I also think a trilateral dialogue on supply chain resilience and export controls, those might be avenues to try to, again, address some issues that are sensitive, but nevertheless where the economic interdependence can actually provide an incentive to deepen the relationship. So I think that after RCEP, it's easier to think about market access, opening exercises between Japan and South Korea too.
Okay, I think we use up all the time given to us, and there are, one very long question raised by the panelists, but I couldn't really respond to that question in more detail. I think we have a very nice and productive or very realistic, kind of discussions for current trade issues, trade situation, where we should go. But the conclusion, if I may, is not very positive. I mean, we are in a very difficult, challenging period, and there's no leader in leading us to the more, conducive and more rules-based kind of international order. And especially, U.S. become much more political. I think the Biden administration will not do anything specific until the next year, November midterm election. Maybe after that, maybe they are thinking about joining the CPTPP or something like that. Other than that, they want to do anything so that they can keep their major majority seats in the Senate and then in Congress, or all kind of things. This is a pity, but in the meantime, middle power countries like Korea and other Australia or Canada, whatever, they are doing something, even though we cannot make a huge challenge, a huge influences, but we can say something so that we can respect the multilateral trading system and the open regionalism or whatever. Well, with this, I want to conclude, but the organizer asked me to deliver this. One last thing is we ask the online participants to fill out a brief survey form regarding today's webinar, so that East Asia Institute can reflect these kind of comments for later or future webinar thing. Well, I want to say, I want to thank our panelists and also our online participants, and also I want to really thank those people who make this website webinar possible. Today's kind of webinar. Thank you very much. We'll conclude this. Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Solis. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Solis. Thank you. 고맙습니다.
고맙습니다.